In the early winter of 1903, the Clinch mountains of southern Appalachia held their breath under a blanket of frost so thick and so absolute it seemed to calcify the very air. This was a land of deep hollows and sharp ridges, a place where the sun was a fleeting visitor even in summer, and where the cold of winter was not merely a season but a state of being, a physical presence that seeped through chinked log walls and settled deep within the bones of those who dwelled there. The ridges, skeletal and gray, clawed at a low, oppressive sky, their slopes thick with the bare, interlocking fingers of dormant hardwoods. Below, in the shadowed valleys, the creeks had frozen into milky ribbons of ice, silencing the constant murmur of water that was the region's heartbeat. Fields lay fallow and dead, their soil hardened into iron, dotted with the brittle stalks of last year's corn, which rattled in the wind with a sound like dry bones. It was a silence that was profound, a quiet born of isolation and the sheer, overwhelming indifference of the wilderness. But in one particular cabin, nestled in a forgotten fold of the mountainside, there existed a silence far deeper, far more deliberate, and infinitely more terrifying. This was the home of the widow, Martha Bell, and for 20 years, her silence had been the most powerful force in the hollow. If these shadowed corners of history are where you feel most at home, and this is your first time in our archives, consider subscribing to ensure you do not lose your place among the records. The cabin itself was a study in grim endurance. Hewn from ancient chestnut logs, now darkened to the color of soot by decades of wood smoke and weather, it seemed less a human construction and more a natural outgrowth of the mountain itself. A single stone chimney, pieced together with mud and sheer will, leaned precariously, breathing a thin, almost apologetic plume of gray smoke into the unforgiving air. The windows were small, parsimonious squares of warped glass that distorted the already bleak world outside into a wavering, dreamlike vista. To approach the cabin was to feel a distinct and unnerving sensation, as if one were trespassing on a place that had long ago been consecrated to something other than human habitation. The air grew colder, the wind seemed to die in the surrounding trees, and the ambient sounds of the forest, the call of a distant bird or the skittering of some unseen creature, would cease altogether. It was a vacuum of sound, with the widow's small home at its epicenter. The people who lived in the scattered homesteads miles away, families who were themselves no strangers to hardship and solitude, spoke of the place only in hushed tones. They said that to stand at the edge of her cleared land was to feel your own words die in your throat. Inside, Martha Bell moved through the dim, cramped space with a practiced economy of motion that bordered on the ritualistic. She was a woman who had been hollowed out by time and by a grief so old it had become a part of her physical structure. Her face was a roadmap of unspoken sorrows, her skin pulled taut over sharp cheekbones, and her eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, seemed to look not at the world but through it, fixed on some distant, internal horizon. She had not uttered a single word, not a syllable, not so much as a sigh that could be mistaken for language, since the day her husband had been lowered into the frozen ground 2 decades prior. Her vow of silence, made over his grave, was a thing of local legend. Some whispered it was a penance, a way to atone for some unspoken sin connected to his sudden and violent death, a logging accident that had left his body mangled beyond recognition. Others, the more fearful and superstitious, believed it was a binding, a pact made with an older, darker power that dwelled in the ancient mountains. They said she had locked a curse within herself, and that to speak would be to unleash it upon the world. Her hands, gnarled and stained with the earth, were never still. They tended her small garden in the warmer months. They mended her worn clothes. They fed the fire that was her only companion. but they never gestured, never formed a shape that might be interpreted as a substitute for speech. Her communication with the world had ceased entirely. Her 3 children, now grown and with families of their own, lived in the same mountain range, close enough that the smoke from their chimneys was visible from her own on a clear day, yet they remained profoundly distant. They were satellites caught in the orbit of her immense silence, their own lives shaped and warped by the gravity of her unspoken vow. The eldest son, Caleb, was a man built of the same tough, unyielding material as the mountains he farmed. His hands were thick with calluses, his face weathered by the sun and wind, and he carried a quiet resentment that simmered just beneath the surface. He remembered, faintly, a time before the silence, a mother whose voice, though rarely warm, was at least present. Now, he saw her as a source of shame, a local peculiarity that reflected poorly on him and his own family. He provided her with firewood and a share of his harvest, leaving the offerings on her porch without a word, a transaction conducted in a shared, inherited quiet. He had never once tried to make her speak. The very thought of it felt like a violation, like trying to pry open a locked tomb. He feared not what she might say, but the very possibility that she could. Her daughter, Ruth, lived in a state of perpetual anxiety. She had inherited her mother's sharp features, but not her iron will. She was a nervous woman, her hands constantly smoothing the fabric of her apron, her eyes darting as if expecting a blow. She was the one who felt the absence of a mother most keenly, a void that had been present for most of her life. She would sometimes walk to the edge of her mother's property, hiding behind the dense thicket of rhododendron, and simply watch the silent cabin, hoping for a sign, a change, any indication that the woman inside was still connected to the world of the living. Ruth would imagine conversations, a flood of words pent up for 20 years, questions she longed to ask about her childhood, about her father, about the crushing weight of the unspoken thing that had consumed their family. But she never dared to cross the threshold. The silence that emanated from the cabin was a physical barrier, a wall of pure negation that she could not bring herself to breach. Her husband, a practical man with little time for what he called mountain nonsense, forbade her from visiting the widow, claiming the woman was touched in the head and a bad influence on their own young children. The youngest son, James, was different from his siblings. He was quieter, more thoughtful, with a bookish inclination that was rare in the hardscrabble world of the Clinch Mountains. He had been only a small child when his mother had taken her vow, and his memories of her voice were fragmented, unreliable whispers from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Unlike Caleb's resentment or Ruth's sorrow, James was consumed by a deep intellectual curiosity about his mother's condition. He saw it not as madness or a curse, but as a puzzle to be solved. He had once, years ago, sought out the town's doctor, a man of limited medical knowledge but extensive experience with the hardships of mountain life. The doctor had listened patiently before explaining that such a thing, while unusual, was not unheard of. He had spoken of hysterical mutism, a condition brought on by severe psychological trauma, where the mind simply severed its connection to the voice as a means of self-preservation. The diagnosis, while clinical, did little to explain the palpable power of his mother's silence. It did not account for the chilling aura that surrounded her home, nor the deep instinctual fear she inspired in all who knew her. James, more than his siblings, understood that his mother was not merely refusing to speak. She was actively, forcefully, and with immense concentration, holding something at bay. For 20 years, this fragile, unspoken arrangement held. The widow remained in her self-imposed exile, and her children lived their lives in the shadow of her legend. The changing of the seasons, the births of grandchildren she would never hear laugh, the deaths of old neighbors she would not mourn with words, all passed without altering the fundamental truth of her existence. Her silence was a constant, a fixed point in the turning world. Then, in the deepest part of that winter of 1903, the equilibrium shattered. The unspoken thing that had been bound for 2 decades began to stir. It began, as all such things do, with a death. The news came to the valley on the back of a frostbitten mule, carried by a neighbor who had found the body. Caleb Bell, the strong, resilient eldest son, was dead. He had been found in his bed by his wife, having passed in the night without a sound, without a struggle. His eyes, the neighbor reported with a tremor in his voice, had been wide open, fixed on a point on the ceiling, as if in profound and utter surprise. There were no marks on his body, no signs of violence or illness. The doctor was summoned, and after a brief and cursory examination in the freezing bedroom, he declared that the man's heart had simply given out. It was a common enough fate for men who worked as hard as Caleb had, he had explained to the grieving widow. But the community did not believe it. A man like Caleb Bell did not simply die. He was a force of nature, as rooted and unshakable as the ancient oaks on the ridge. His sudden, silent passing felt unnatural, a disruption of the established order of things. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading from cabin to cabin like a contagion. They connected the strangeness of the death to the strangeness of the man's mother. They recalled the old stories, the theories that her silence was a cage for a curse, and they began to wonder, had the cage finally begun to break? The fear was a living thing now, no longer a half-forgotten piece of folklore, but a present and immediate threat. The story of Caleb's death reached the ears of the town's preacher, a man who served a small, clapboard church in the nearest settlement. He was a stern, devout man whose faith was a rigid and uncompromising shield against the darkness he believed was endemic to the mountains and the old ways that still lingered there. He saw the devil's hand in the superstitions of the local people, and he saw Martha Bell's vow not as a sign of grief, but as an act of profound spiritual arrogance, a refusal to communicate with God or man. He had preached against her from his pulpit, calling her silence a blasphemy. Upon hearing of Caleb's death, and the subsequent tide of fear and speculation it had unleashed, the preacher knew he had to act. He saw a spiritual crisis unfolding, a community on the verge of succumbing to pagan dread. He believed the family was under a spiritual attack, one that had found a foothold in the unholy void of the widow's silence. His solution was simple, direct, and, in his mind, the only course of action that could save the remaining family members from a similar fate. They had to confront the source of the darkness. They had to return to the silent house, to the mute matriarch, and they had to pray. He declared that the family must gather at Martha Bell's cabin to bring the light of the Lord into the place that had known only shadows for so long. He told Ruth and James that it was their Christian duty, that to refuse would be to abandon their brother's soul and to invite damnation upon their own. The command was received not with relief, but with a deep and paralyzing dread. For Ruth and James, their mother's cabin was not a place of potential salvation. It was the origin point of their deepest fears. The thought of being enclosed within those 4 walls, trapped with the immense, suffocating weight of her silence, was more terrifying than any abstract notion of a curse. But the preacher's authority was absolute, and in their grief and confusion, they found themselves unable to resist his certainty. And so, 2 days after their brother was laid to rest in the frozen earth, Ruth and James began the solemn, terrible journey back to the home of their mother. They walked through the snow-dusted woods, the silence of the winter landscape, a prelude to the more profound silence that awaited them. Every creak of a branch under the weight of ice, every gust of wind that moaned through the hollow, seemed to be a warning. With each step, they felt they were not simply walking towards a cabin, but moving backward in time, towards a primal fear they had spent their entire adult lives trying to escape. They were returning to the heart of the family's wound, stepping knowingly into the place where the curse had been born, a place that had just begun to claim its due. The thin, gray smoke rising from the chimney was visible now, a fragile signal in the desolate wilderness, and they knew that their mother, the widow Martha Bell, was waiting for them. The room where Caleb Bell had died was a pocket of unnatural cold. Even with a fire roaring in the hearth of the main living space, the air in the small bedroom remained frigid, clinging to the skin and stealing the breath. It was a cold that felt ancient and deliberate, a chill that did not seem to emanate from the winter outside, but from a source within the room itself. His wife had been the first to notice it. Waking in the pre-dawn gloom, she had reached for her husband and found his side of the bed not merely cool, but cold as a river stone. The stillness of him was the next thing she registered, a profound and absolute lack of motion that was utterly alien to the man who, even in sleep, was a restless presence. When she had lit the lamp, its flickering oily light had revealed the truth. Caleb was lying on his back, the rough wool blanket pulled neatly to his chest, but his eyes were open. They were not the glazed, unfocused eyes of the dead. They were clear, horribly alert, and fixed upon the low, timbered ceiling with an expression of intense, motionless shock, as if he had been watching the approach of some incredible, silent spectacle. The local doctor, when he finally arrived, had performed what passed for a forensic examination in that remote corner of the world. He had checked for a pulse, listened for a breath, and lifted one of the man's eyelids only to find the same unnerving clarity beneath. He spoke of heart failure, a common enough affliction, but his words were a thin veneer of science stretched over a deeper, more primal uncertainty. No one who saw the body, who stood in that unnaturally cold room and met that wide, unblinking stare, truly believed Caleb Bell had died of natural causes. He looked like a man who had been scared to death, his very soul frozen in the final moment of terror. It was James, the younger brother, who found the other anomaly. Several days after the funeral, he had returned to his brother's homestead to help Caleb's grieving wife with the grim task of sorting through the deceased's meager possessions. While outside, stacking firewood that his brother would never use, his gaze was drawn to the exterior wall of the bedroom where Caleb had died. There, etched into the weathered wood of the log beneath the windowsill, were a series of symbols. They were not carved with any kind of skill or precision. They looked as if they had been frantically clawed into the surface with a shard of rock or a piece of sharpened bone. The marks were angular, jagged, a chaotic geometry that seemed to mock the natural grain of the wood. James ran his gloved fingers over them, feeling the raw, splintered edges. They were fresh. He recognized their form, not from any book, but from the whispered folklore of the mountains, the half-forgotten pagan beliefs that Christianity had failed to completely eradicate. These were runes, crude approximations of old mountain symbols that were said to serve a single, grim purpose. They were wards, meant to silence the restless dead, to bind a troubled spirit to its grave and prevent it from speaking to the living. The discovery sent a tremor of cold through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. The implication was monstrous. Someone had stood outside his brother's window on the night he died and carved these symbols. And these were not marks intended to cause a death. They were marks intended to manage the consequences of one. The question immediately formed in his mind, sharp and terrible. Was this a sign that his mother's curse was real, or was it the signature of something else, something even older than her vow of silence? This physical evidence, this tangible sign of ritual, transformed the situation. It elevated the family's tragedy into a matter of grave spiritual concern, confirming the worst fears of Reverend Thomas Clay. The preacher was a man whose faith had been forged in the hard theology of sin and redemption, and he saw the world as a battlefield between the forces of God and the insidious whispers of Satan. He believed the old ways of the mountains, the folklore and superstitions, were not harmless tales, but active channels for demonic influence. When James, deeply disturbed, sought him out and described the symbols under the window, the preacher's face hardened into a mask of righteous certainty. He saw not a mystery, but a manifestation. The silence of the widow, he concluded, had created a spiritual vacuum, and in the absence of prayer and spoken faith, a darker power had been invited in. He announced his intention to go to Martha Bell's cabin directly. He would not send for her, nor would he wait for an invitation. He would take the sword of the Spirit into the heart of the enemy's camp. He would confront the silent woman and command, in the name of God, that she cast out the evil she had harbored. His journey to the cabin was a pilgrimage into a land he considered profane. He rode his horse as far as the path allowed, then dismounted to continue on foot, his black coat a stark, funereal shape against the unending white of the snow. The silence of the hollow was different from the peaceful quiet of his own church. This was a heavy, watchful silence, a quiet that seemed to listen. As he drew closer to the cabin, he felt a palpable sense of resistance, as if the very air were thickening, pushing against him. He could smell the wood smoke now, and with it, another, stranger scent on the wind. It was the smell of burnt salt and the sharp, resinous aroma of pine needles, not burning in a fire, but heated as if for some ritual purpose. The scent was both medicinal and occult, and it set the preacher's teeth on edge. He arrived at the edge of the clearing and saw her standing in the doorway of the cabin, a still, gray figure perfectly framed by the dark wood. She was not looking at him, but past him, towards the path from which he had just emerged, her posture utterly calm, completely devoid of surprise. It was as if she had been waiting for him all along. He strode across the cleared ground, his boots crunching in the snow, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. He stopped a few feet from her, his own breath pluming in the frigid air. The interior of the cabin was visible behind her, a space of deep shadows and oppressive austerity. A single fire burned in the stone hearth, casting a weak, trembling light on the bare wooden walls. The room was meticulously clean, yet it felt profoundly unwell. The air inside was thick with the scent of salt and pine, and a faint, coppery tang that he could not identify. He began to speak, his voice a powerful instrument honed by years of sermons, yet it sounded small and brittle in the face of her monumental silence. He told her that he had come in the name of the Lord. He spoke of her son, Caleb, and the dark manner of his passing. He described the symbols carved beneath the window, calling them marks of the devil, a sign that a curse was upon her house. He commanded her to repent of her sin of silence, to open her mouth and let the word of God cleanse the evil that had taken root in her family. He spoke of hellfire and damnation, of the eternal torment that awaited those who turned their back on the grace of the church. His words filled the small space, echoing off the bare walls, a torrent of faith and fury. Through it all, Martha Bell did not move. She did not blink. Her eyes, those pale, storm-colored eyes, remained fixed on his face. Her expression was unreadable, a blank canvas of wrinkled skin and old sorrow. But her silence was not passive. It was an active force, a solid thing that met his words and absorbed them, deadening their power. He felt as though he were trying to fill a bottomless well. The longer he spoke, the more foolish he felt, his own voice sounding increasingly hollow, his certainty beginning to fray at the edges. He was a man of God, a representative of the highest authority he knew. And yet, in the presence of this small, mute woman, he felt like a child shouting at a mountain. She was not intimidated. She was not moved. She was not even, it seemed, listening in any conventional sense. She was simply enduring him, her silence an unbreachable fortress against which his faith was breaking. Finally, his words faltered. The sermon died in his throat, leaving a raw, aching quiet in its wake. He had come to cast out a demon, but he found himself in the presence of something he could not comprehend, something for which his theology had no name. He saw in her eyes not madness, not evil, but a resolve so ancient and so profound it felt geologic. Defeated, and for the first time in his life, truly afraid, the preacher turned without another word and walked away, leaving the widow standing in her doorway, her silence utterly intact, utterly victorious. The failure of the preacher's intervention plunged the remaining family into a new depth of despair. If the church could not save them, what could? The symbols on the wall of Caleb's home were now seen by everyone as an undeniable omen. The curse was not just a story, it was real, and it was methodical. Ruth, in particular, became consumed by a desperate, frantic fear. She saw the curse as a predator, stalking the members of her family one by one, and she believed that their only chance of survival was to stay together, to present a united front against the encroaching darkness. Her logic was that of a terrified child. If she could stay close to the source of the curse, she could somehow watch it, understand it, and perhaps even prevent it from striking again. Against the strenuous objections of her husband and the worried pleas of her brother, James, she made a fateful decision. She would go and stay with her mother. She packed a small bag of belongings and announced that she would not leave the widow's side until the threat had passed. James argued that she was walking into the lion's den, that the cabin was not a sanctuary, but the epicenter of their ruin. But her fear was greater than his reason. She was convinced that leaving her mother alone was a form of abandonment that the curse would punish. She believed that her presence, the presence of a loving daughter, could somehow penetrate the 2 decades of silence and heal the wound that had festered for so long. And so, under the same oppressive gray sky that had witnessed the preacher's defeat, Ruth made her own journey to the silent cabin. She walked into the cold, still air of the hollow, not as an invader, but as a supplicant, hoping to find safety in the very place from which all their terror sprang. She crossed the threshold, and the heavy wooden door closed behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing with a dreadful finality. Inside, the widow's silence seemed to deepen, to draw itself around the new presence in the room, and the old house settled, as if it had just been waiting for the next guest to arrive. The atmosphere inside the widow's cabin was not merely quiet, it was a living, breathing entity, a pressure on the eardrums and a weight on the soul. For Ruth, the first few hours of her self-imposed vigil were a torment of heightened sensory awareness. Every sound was magnified, every shadow seemed to hold a malevolent intelligence. The gentle hiss and pop of the fire in the hearth sounded like whispers. The creak of the floorboards under her own nervous weight was like a scream. The wind, pressing against the chinked logs of the walls, moaned with a distinctly human cadence, a mournful, wordless lament. And at the center of it all was her mother, a figure of absolute, unmoving stillness. The widow sat in her simple, straight-backed rocking chair by the fire, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the flames. She had acknowledged Ruth's arrival with a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that conveyed neither welcome nor surprise, but a kind of grim acceptance. She did not offer her daughter food or drink. She did not indicate a place for her to sit or sleep. She simply continued her silent communion with the fire, leaving Ruth to navigate the suffocating confines of the small room on her own. Ruth tried to fill the void with activity. She swept the already clean floor. She straightened the threadbare blanket on the simple cot that was her mother's bed. She stoked the fire, adding logs with trembling hands. But these small domestic acts were swallowed by the immense silence, rendered meaningless by the sheer unyielding force of her mother's will. As day bled into a long and terrifying night, a new and more disturbing phenomenon began. The ambient sounds of the old house, the creaks and groans of wood contracting in the cold, the sighing of the wind, began to resolve into something that sounded unnervingly like speech. At first, it was just a murmur, a low, indistinct hum that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the cabin. Ruth pressed her ear to the rough, cold logs of the wall, straining to listen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound was not coming from outside. It was inside the wood itself, a vibration that felt ancient and alive. As the hours passed, the murmurs grew clearer, the cadence more defined. She could almost make out words, fragments of sentences spoken in a chorus of faint, overlapping voices. They were whispers, layered one on top of the other, a tapestry of sound that was both meaningless and profoundly, terrifyingly familiar. She realized, with a jolt of pure, ice-cold horror, that the cadence of the whispers, the rhythm and flow of the phantom speech, perfectly mirrored the patterns of her own thoughts. When a wave of fear washed over her, the whispers would rise in pitch and speed, becoming frantic and panicked. When she tried to calm herself, to think of a prayer or a childhood hymn, the whispers would slow, taking on a soothing, almost hypnotic quality. It was as if the house itself was listening to her, learning her, and then speaking her own mind back to her in a dead, hollow echo. Terrified, she looked at her mother, who remained in her chair, seemingly oblivious to the sonic haunting that was unfolding around them. But as Ruth watched, she saw that her mother's lips were moving, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor, forming words that produced no sound. The widow was speaking, but her voice was being absorbed by the silence, or perhaps being channeled directly into the walls of the house. Ruth understood then that she was not losing her mind. She was not imagining the voices. She was hearing her mother's thoughts. For 20 years, the widow's unspoken words, her grief, her rage, her memories, had not vanished. They had seeped into the very fabric of her home, saturating the wood, the stone, the dust in the air, until the cabin itself had become a resonant chamber for her silent, unending monologue. Ruth was now an unwilling audience to 2 decades of raw, unfiltered consciousness, a torrent of memory and emotion that had been locked away from the world. The experience was an unspeakable violation, an intimacy so profound it felt like a physical assault. She was hearing the story of her family from a perspective she had never known, a narrative steeped in a sorrow so deep it bordered on madness. Driven by a desperate need for some kind of rational explanation, for anything that could ground her in the familiar world, Ruth began a frantic search of the small, one-room cabin. She looked for letters, for a photograph, for any artifact from the past that might offer a clue to the origin of the family's tragedy. In a small, dust-covered wooden chest tucked beneath the cot, she found it. It was not a letter, but a journal. The book was bound in cracked, weathered leather, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting inside was not her mother's. It was a precise, elegant script, the hand of an educated man, but the ink was faded, the words blurring into the page. It took her a moment to recognize it as the handwriting of the preacher who had served the community when she was a child, the man who had presided over her father's funeral and who had, she now recalled, been a frequent visitor to the cabin in the weeks that followed. The journal was not a record of sermons or church business. It was a private, tormented confession. The entry she found was dated just a few weeks after her father's death. In it, the old preacher described a conversation with her mother, Martha Bell, a conversation that had taken place before the vow of silence had begun. The words on the page laid bare the secret that had been buried for 20 years. Her father's death had not been an accident. He had been a hard man, the journal explained, prone to fits of violent rage, especially when he drank. One night, in a drunken fury, he had turned his anger on their youngest child, a boy named Eli, a child whose existence Ruth had all but forgotten, a brother who had died so young he was little more than a phantom in her memory. The preacher's account was stark and unflinching. The man had beaten the small child, and the child's subsequent death had been passed off as a fever. The journal then described Martha Bell's confession to him, her voice choked with a guilt that was not her own. She had told the preacher everything. The final, terrible line of the entry burned itself into Ruth's mind. The preacher had written, he had told her that the sin was not in the act itself, which was a matter for God's judgment, but in the speaking of it. He had convinced her that to give voice to such a monstrous secret would be to unleash a greater evil, a scandal that would destroy the family and the community's faith. Her speech was the sin that would kill them all. He had commanded her to take a vow of silence, to bury the story so deep that not even God would hear it. Her silence was not a curse she had invoked. It was a penance that had been imposed upon her. The revelation struck Ruth with the force of a physical blow. The entire foundation of her life, the central mystery that had defined her family, was a lie. Her mother was not a monster. She was a victim, a prisoner of a secret she had been forbidden to share. The silence was not a wall she had built to keep her children out. It was a cage she had been locked in to protect them. The voices in the walls suddenly made a new, more terrible kind of sense. They were not just her mother's thoughts. They were the echoes of a story that had been denied a voice, a truth that had been buried alive and was now clawing its way to the surface through the very structure of its confinement. Overwhelmed by a mixture of horror, pity, and a lifetime of unexpressed love for her mother, Ruth stumbled towards the rocking chair. She fell to her knees, clutching at the widow's rough, homespun dress. She tried to speak, to tell her mother that she knew, that she understood, that she was sorry, but the words would not come. The silence in the room was too powerful, too absolute. It filled her mouth, her throat, her lungs, choking the very air from her body. Her last sensation was of her mother's hand, for the first time in 20 years, reaching out and gently touching her hair, a gesture of comfort that had come 2 decades too late. The next morning, when James arrived at the cabin, his heart heavy with a premonition of dread, he found the door unlatched. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was filled with a profound and deathly cold. His mother was sitting in her rocking chair, exactly as she had been the day before, her face as impassive and unreadable as ever. His sister, Ruth, was lying on the floor at her mother's feet. She was dead. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling in the same attitude of silent, frozen shock as their brother Caleb's had been. But there was another, more grotesque detail. Her mouth was agape, and it was packed tightly, to the point of overflowing, with the black, loamy soil from the earth outside the cabin door. It was a symbolic act of such horrifying specificity, it could only be a message. She had learned the secret, the truth that had been buried, and she had been silenced in the most literal and brutal way imaginable. The house had shared its story, and then it had demanded the ultimate price for that knowledge. The silence had claimed another victim, not by a curse spoken aloud, but by the terrible, devouring power of a truth that had been forced to remain unspoken for far too long. The death of his sister, and the grotesquely symbolic manner of her end, shattered the last remnants of James's skepticism. He was no longer a detached observer, a curious son attempting to solve the psychological puzzle of his mother's mutism. He was now the last survivor, the final name on a list being methodically, inexorably crossed out. The grief he felt for Ruth was a sharp, physical pain, but it was overshadowed by a cold, clarifying terror. He understood now that he was not merely dealing with a family tragedy, nor with a superstitious curse whispered about in the hollows. He was facing an active, intelligent malevolence, a force that operated with a chilling, ritualistic logic. The black soil in Ruth's mouth was not a random act of madness. It was a statement, a grim and purposeful seal placed upon a secret. It was a declaration that some things are meant to remain buried, and that to unearth them is to invite a terrible and immediate judgment. He knew, with an instinct that went deeper than reason, that the key to his own survival, and the answer to the entire horrifying enigma, lay not within the haunted walls of the cabin, but in the dark earth that surrounded it. The soil in his sister's mouth was a clue, a signpost pointing him toward the origin of the sin. He waited until his mother was occupied with her morning ritual of fetching water from the frozen creek, a task she performed with the same slow, deliberate pace she applied to everything. He watched her disappear down the narrow path, a solitary, gray figure moving through a gray and frozen world, and then he began his work. He went to the small, dilapidated shed behind the cabin, the place where his father had once stored his tools. He found a shovel, its wooden handle smooth and dark from years of use, its metal blade rusted and pitted but still strong. He returned to the back of the cabin, his eyes scanning the small, cleared patch of land that bordered the dense, encroaching forest. He was looking for a disturbance, an anomaly in the landscape, a place where the ground was not quite right. He found it near an old, gnarled oak tree, whose bare branches looked like skeletal fingers scratching at the sky. It was a shallow depression in the earth, a place where the ground had settled unevenly over time, a subtle indentation that would be invisible to a casual observer, but to a man searching for a grave, it was as clear as a headstone. The winter frost had hardened the top layer of soil into a brittle crust. The first few impacts of the shovel were loud and sharp, a series of percussive cracks that echoed unnervingly in the profound silence of the hollow. Each strike felt like a violation, a profanity hurled against the stillness. But as he broke through the frost and began to dig into the softer, blacker earth beneath, the sound changed. It became a series of soft, rhythmic thuds, a muffled, heart-like beat that seemed to be counting down his final hours. The work was grueling. The cold seeped through his coat and his gloves, numbing his hands and his feet. His breath came in ragged white plumes. But he was driven by a frantic, desperate energy, a certainty that he was digging not just for answers, but for his very life. After what felt like an eternity, the shovel struck something that was not stone and was not a root. It was a dull, hollow thud, the sound of metal hitting soft, decaying wood. He dropped to his knees and began to dig with his bare hands, clawing at the cold, damp earth, his fingers numb and raw. He uncovered the remnants of a small, crudely made wooden box, its planks so rotten they had all but disintegrated into the surrounding soil. It was a child's coffin, built with a father's rough, untutored hands. And inside, nestled amongst the collapsed wood and the dark, rich earth, was the proof. It was not a skeleton, for the acidic mountain soil and the passage of 20 years had consumed the small bones almost entirely. It was a child's toy. A small, whittled bird, its form simple and naive, its wood softened and grayed with decay. He recognized it instantly, a ghost from the deepest, most inaccessible corner of his memory. It was the bird his brother Eli had always carried, a small talisman he had clutched in his hand even in sleep. The sight of it, lying in this unmarked, unhallowed grave, unlocked a flood of fragmented images in his mind. He remembered a small, quiet boy with his mother's pale eyes. He remembered the sound of his father's heavy, angry footsteps on the cabin floor. He remembered a night of shouting, a sound that was abruptly and terrifyingly cut short. And he remembered a profound and heavy silence in the house the next morning, a silence that was the precursor to the greater, more permanent silence that was to come. The discovery of the grave and the memories it unearthed was like finding the missing piece of a puzzle that revealed a picture of unimaginable horror. The stories he had dismissed as local gossip, the whispers he had heard his entire life about his father's temper, now coalesced into a coherent and terrible narrative. He remembered hearing the older men in the community talk, their voices low and careful, after his father had died. They had spoken of his father's drinking, of a darkness in him that would sometimes break free. They had hinted at the unnatural swiftness of the youngest child's death, the way the boy had simply vanished from the life of the community, buried quickly and quietly with no formal service. At the time, James had been too young to understand the implications, and as he grew older, he had relegated the talk to the cruel and baseless rumors of a small, isolated community. But now, with the evidence of the grave before him, he saw the truth. His mother's vow of silence was not a penance for a sin she had committed. It was a punishment for a sin she had witnessed. The old preacher, in a misguided and arrogant attempt to preserve the sanctity of the family and the moral order of his congregation, had commanded her to become a living tomb for her husband's monstrous secret. He had sentenced her to a lifetime of silence, forcing her to carry the knowledge of her child's murder and her other children's ignorance as a solitary, crushing burden. With the cold, damp soil still clinging to his hands and the whittled bird clutched in his fist, James walked back into the cabin. The room was dark, the fire having once again burned low. His mother was in her chair, a motionless silhouette against the dying embers. He walked to her, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and stood before her. He did not need to speak. He simply opened his hand and held out the small, wooden bird. For a long moment, she did not react. Her eyes remained fixed on the fire. Then, slowly, as if moving a limb that had been asleep for 20 years, she raised her head. Her gaze fell upon the toy, and for the first time in 2 decades, her expression changed. The blank, impassive mask crumbled, and the raw, unendurable agony that had been imprisoned behind it was finally visible. A tremor ran through her body, a violent, convulsive shudder. A sound escaped her throat, a dry, rasping noise, the sound of a voice struggling to remember its own function. James fell to his knees before her, his own tears now flowing freely, a mixture of grief for his lost siblings, for the brother he had never truly known, and for the mother whose suffering he was only now beginning to comprehend. He begged her to speak. He told her that he knew, that the secret was out, that her penance was over. He pleaded with her to break the vow, to let go of the burden that had cost them everything. He told her that her silence was killing them, and that only her voice could save him now. He watched, his heart caught between hope and terror, as she slowly, deliberately opened her mouth, the deep lines around it cracking like dry earth. She drew a breath, a ragged, hitching gasp that seemed to pull all the air and all the silence from the room, and prepared to speak for the first time in 20 years. The sound that emerged from Martha Bell's throat was not a word. It was not a cry of grief or a shout of rage. It was a noise that belonged to a world before language, a primal utterance dredged up from a place of geological grief. It was a single, elongated syllable, a sound that was both a vowel and a consonant, a vibration that seemed to hold within it the resonant frequency of the ancient mountains themselves. It was a word spoken in a dialect long dead, a forgotten tongue of the earliest settlers, a language that held a different, more intimate relationship with the land, with the rocks and the trees and the dark, hidden things that slept beneath the soil. The word did not travel through the air in the conventional sense. It seemed to originate from all points in the small cabin simultaneously, a sonic event that was also a physical force. The moment it was spoken, the very structure of the home reacted as if struck by a massive, invisible blow. The cabin, which had stood for decades against the wind and the snow and the slow, relentless pressure of time, began to shake. It was not the trembling of a foundation settling, but a violent, unnatural convulsion, as if the logs themselves were trying to tear themselves apart. A web of cracks instantly radiated across the warped, grimy glass of the two small windows, the sound of their breaking a sharp, crystalline counterpoint to the deep, guttural word that still hung in the air. The single oil lamp that sat on the small wooden table flickered wildly, its flame elongating and contracting as if caught in a gale, before it was extinguished altogether, plunging the room into a deep, terrifying twilight, lit only by the dying, red pulse of the embers in the hearth. The air grew thick, charged with a palpable static that made the hairs on James's arms and the back of his neck stand on end. He could feel the pressure in the room changing, a heavy, crushing weight that pressed down on him, making it difficult to breathe. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if the familiar, three-dimensional space of the cabin was warping, its corners no longer meeting at right angles, its ceiling and floor subtly, sickeningly, beginning to shift. The ground beneath his knees, the very earth on which the cabin was built, seemed to exhale, a low, resonant groan that vibrated up through his bones. It felt as though the house were no longer a passive structure, but had become the body of some vast, awakening entity, and his mother's voice had been the signal for its rousing. Every object in the room seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. The tin plates on the shelf rattled with a furious, metallic clatter. The simple wooden furniture, the cot, the table, the chairs, began to slide across the floorboards in short, jarring movements, as if being shoved by unseen hands. A fine dust, the accumulated residue of 20 years of silent history, rained down from the rafters, filling the air with a choking haze that swirled in the dim, red light from the fireplace. Through this chaos, James looked at his mother. She had not moved from her chair. The single, terrible word had been her only contribution to the pandemonium she had unleashed. Her body was rigid, her hands gripping the arms of the rocking chair with a white-knuckled intensity, but her face was transformed. The grief and agony of a moment before had been replaced by an expression of pure, ecstatic release. Her eyes were wide, glowing with a reflected, crimson light from the embers, and they were fixed on something in the center of the room that only she could see. She looked like a priestess who had finally, after a lifetime of silent devotion, successfully invoked her god. James scrambled backwards, away from her, his mind struggling to process the sensory and metaphysical assault. The rational part of his brain, the part that had sought clinical explanations and historical truths, was screaming. This was not a psychological break. This was not a phenomenon of acoustics or atmospheric pressure. This was an unveiling. His mother's silence had not been a cage to hold a secret in. It had been a seal. It had been a binding ritual, a 20-year act of containment, holding back a power that she had, in her grief and despair, made a pact with. The silence was not the curse. It was the ward against something infinitely worse. Her grief, her rage at her husband, her sorrow for her murdered child, had been so immense, so absolute, that it had become a thing of supernatural substance. It had festered in the silence, growing in strength, until it had achieved a form of consciousness, a territorial, malevolent spirit that had fused with the house and the land it stood on. The word she had spoken was not a confession. It was not a release of her own pain. It was a name. It was the name of the entity her sorrow had birthed, and in speaking it, she had given it permission to fully manifest, to cross the threshold from the metaphysical to the physical. He realized then, with a final, soul-crushing certainty, the true nature of his siblings' deaths. Caleb, whose eyes were frozen in shock, had not been frightened by a ghost. He had simply woken in the night to find the very fabric of his reality, the walls and ceiling of his own bedroom, staring back at him with a silent, hungry intelligence. Ruth, with her mouth full of soil, had not been punished for learning a secret. She had been consumed by it, literally absorbed by the living earth that now answered to her mother's command. And now it was his turn. He could feel it. The house was not just shaking anymore. It was breathing. He felt a slow, rhythmic exhalation of air, a cold, foul gust that smelled of damp earth and cellar rot and something else, something metallic and vaguely alive. The breath washed over him, and all the strength, all the warmth, all the life seemed to drain out of him in an instant. His limbs grew heavy, his vision began to tunnel, the frantic beating of his heart slowing to a thick, syrupy crawl. He was not being attacked. He was being undone. He was being unwritten from the world. His last conscious act was to look at his mother, the architect of his annihilation. She was still in her chair, a serene, terrible smile now gracing her lips, as the house she had filled with her silence finally, completely, inhaled her last living child. Days later, when the preacher, Reverend Thomas Clay, had not heard any news from the Bell family, a deep and troubling unease settled upon him. He felt a nagging sense of responsibility, a fear that his own intervention, his arrogant attempt to impose his faith on a sorrow he had not understood, had somehow made things worse. He made the journey back to the hollow, a sense of grim foreboding growing with every step. He found the cabin not destroyed, not burned to the ground, but empty. It stood in the gray winter light, silent and still, but its stillness was different now. It was not the watchful, waiting silence of before. It was the inert, absolute silence of a place that was truly and irrevocably vacant. The door hung open on a single hinge. Inside, the room was in a state of disarray, furniture overturned, a thick layer of dust and debris covering everything. It looked as if a great storm had been confined entirely within its four walls. There was no sign of James. There was no sign of the widow, Martha Bell. They had simply vanished. The preacher stood on the threshold for a long time, the cold wind blowing through the empty doorway, and he knew that he was standing on the site of a finished thing. The story, whatever it had been, was over. The house was just a house again, a hollowed-out shell, its terrible energy expended, its purpose fulfilled. He backed away slowly, a prayer forming on his lips, a prayer not of salvation but of pure, unadulterated fear. The silence had not been broken. It had merely found its ultimate expression, and in doing so, had consumed everything. The immediate aftermath of the Bell family's annihilation was marked not by a dramatic investigation or a flurry of official activity, but by a slow, creeping silence that spread outwards from the hollow, infecting the entire community. Reverend Thomas Clay, shaken to the core of his faith, reported the family's disappearance to the county sheriff, a man for whom the law ended where the thick woods and the steep ridges began. A cursory search was mounted, a few men who knew the mountains picking their way through the snow to the deserted cabin. They found what the preacher had found, an empty, disordered home, a profound and unsettling stillness, and no tracks leading away from the property that the falling snow had not already erased. There was no sign of violence, no bodies to bury, nothing to suggest what had transpired beyond the unsettling neatness of the family's erasure from the world. In the absence of evidence, the official record was closed with a simple, unsatisfying notation, removed from the county. But the people of the mountains knew better. They knew that a family so deeply rooted in that soil did not simply leave, especially not in the dead of winter. They had been taken. They had been consumed by the silence that the widow had kept, a silence that had finally grown hungry. In the years that followed, the story of Martha Bell and her children underwent a strange and powerful alchemy. It ceased to be a memory of a specific tragedy and began its long, slow transformation into myth. The cabin was abandoned to the elements, its roof sagging, its walls slowly surrendering to the relentless pressure of the forest. No one dared to salvage its logs for firewood or its stones for a new foundation. The land around it was considered blighted, a patch of ground that had been soured by an unnatural sorrow. It became a place of initiation for brave or foolish boys, who would dare each other to touch the rotting doorframe before sprinting away, their laughter high and nervous in the thin mountain air. The story became a cautionary tale, a piece of folklore told around winter fires to frighten children and to remind adults of the dark, ancient power that slept just beneath the surface of their Christian lives. The details shifted with each telling. In some versions, the widow was a witch who had sold her soul for the power to avenge her murdered child. In others, she was a saint who had taken the sins of her husband upon herself, her silence a holy penance. But in every version of the tale, the core elements remained the same: the vow of silence, the children who died one by one, and the final, terrible sound that had emptied the hollow of all human life. Decades passed. The world changed. The automobile began to snake its way up the winding mountain roads, bringing with it the mail, the radio, and the slow, inexorable encroachment of the 20th century. The generation that had known the Bells died off, and their children, and their children's children, inherited the story, though it had lost its sharp, painful edges and had been worn smooth by time, becoming as much a part of the landscape as the ridges and the creeks. Reverend Clay himself grew old and died, his final years troubled by a spiritual doubt he never confessed to his congregation, haunted by the memory of a silent woman whose faith, in its own terrible way, had proved stronger than his own. A new preacher came to the small clapboard church, a young man from the city, filled with a more modern, less fire and brimstone understanding of God. He was a scholar as much as a clergyman, with a keen interest in the folklore and history of the region he now called home. He heard the story of the mute widow of Clinch Hollow, and he was fascinated. He saw it not as a literal account of a supernatural event, but as a powerful, allegorical expression of the region's deep-seated legacy of isolation, poverty, and unresolved grief. He decided, as a historical exercise, that he would visit the site of the old Bell cabin to see for himself the place that had given birth to such a potent and enduring legend. He chose a day in late autumn, when the last of the leaves had fallen and the mountains were a stark etching of gray and brown against a steel-white sky. A light, wet snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, the flakes fat and silent, melting as they touched the ground. The new preacher was a hale and hearty man, and he made the long walk into the hollow with a sense of academic excitement. The silence, when he first entered the deep fold of the mountains where the cabin had stood, was absolute. The snowfall acted as a natural sound dampener, muting the world, muffling the sound of his own footsteps until he felt as though he were floating through the landscape. He could hear only the sound of his own breathing and the soft, rhythmic thump of his own heart. He found the ruins easily enough. The cabin had almost completely collapsed in on itself, its roof a tangle of rotten beams, its chimney a crumbling pile of stones now covered in a carpet of green moss. It looked ancient, primeval, less like a human dwelling, and more like the discovered skeleton of some great, long-dead beast. He walked the perimeter of the ruin, his scholarly mind making notes, observing the way the forest had reclaimed its territory, imagining the lives that had been lived and lost in this desolate place. It was as he circled to the rear of the collapsed structure that he saw it. Partially hidden beneath a tangle of wild briars was a single, upright stone. It was not a formal headstone, but a long, flat river stone that had been purposefully driven into the earth to serve as a marker. As he drew closer, he saw that its surface was not bare. Carved into the weathered gray stone, deep and unmistakable, were a series of angular, jagged symbols. He recognized them from a book he had studied on the pre-Christian folk traditions of the British Isles, the ancestral home of so many of the Appalachian settlers. They were runes, and though he was no expert, he knew enough to understand that they were not symbols of remembrance. They were symbols of binding, wards meant to contain a restless or malevolent spirit. His academic detachment began to falter, replaced by a prickling sense of unease. He knelt in the damp, cold leaves, the snow melting on his shoulders, and ran his fingers over the carvings. They were impossibly old, yet they felt strangely active, as if a faint energy still hummed within them. This was not folklore. This was a grave. And it was a grave that someone had felt the need to seal with a specific, ritualistic power. This was the grave of the widow, Martha Bell. He stood, a profound chill running through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. The silence of the hollow seemed to change then. It was no longer the peaceful, snow-muffled quiet of the woods. It deepened, coalesced, becoming a watchful, intelligent presence. He felt, with an utter certainty, that he was being observed. The story he had dismissed as a fascinating but fanciful legend suddenly felt chillingly, terribly real. He found himself thinking of the final, unresolved question in every telling of the tale. What had happened to the widow? The legend said she had simply vanished, but this grave suggested a different, more deliberate end. Had someone brought her back here? Had someone buried her and placed this binding stone upon her to ensure that whatever she had become would remain in the ground? As he stood there, pondering the questions, a sound began to intrude upon the silence. It was a faint, dry whispering, like the sound of wind rustling through dead leaves, yet there was no wind. The snow fell straight down in the still air. He strained to listen, telling himself it was just the trick of the wind in the hollow logs of the fallen cabin, or the sound of a nearby creek. But the sound grew, becoming more distinct, more articulate. It was not one voice, but many, a layered chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the very air around him, from the trees, from the stones, from the soil beneath his feet. The voices were speaking in no language he could recognize, a sibilant, flowing tongue that felt older than the mountains themselves. The new preacher was a man of faith, a man who believed in a world beyond the one he could see. But this was a spiritual encounter for which his seminary training had left him wholly unprepared. This was not the voice of God, nor the tempting whispers of the devil he had read about. This was something else, something terrestrial, elemental, and utterly indifferent to his conception of heaven and hell. It was the voice of the place itself, a place that had been saturated with a human sorrow so powerful it had bent the laws of nature. He began to back away from the grave, his heart hammering in his chest. He told himself to run, to turn and flee this unholy ground. But a morbid, scholarly curiosity, the same curiosity that had brought him here, held him in place. He wanted to understand. He had to know. He closed his eyes, focusing all of his attention on the whispering, trying to find a pattern, a single, coherent thread in the chaotic tapestry of sound. Slowly, one voice began to distinguish itself from the others. It grew louder, clearer, shedding its ancient alien cadence and adopting a new one. It was a perfect mimicry of a human voice, a clear, calm, androgynous tone that was both beautiful and terrifying. The other whispers faded, leaving only this single, articulate voice. It spoke, and the sound was not in the air around him, but directly inside his own mind. It spoke a single word. It spoke his name. The preacher's eyes snapped open. The world around him, the gray trees, the falling snow, the crumbling ruins of the cabin, all seemed to recede, to lose their substance. In that moment, he understood. He understood with a clarity that was a form of damnation. Martha Bell had never truly left. Her silence had not been an absence of speech. It had been a gathering of power. Her grief had been a seed, planted in the fertile ground of the hollow, and it had grown into this whispering consciousness, this sentient landscape that remembered all who entered it. Her curse was not a single, spoken thing. It was an eternal, listening presence. It had learned, it had waited, and now it was speaking again. The mountain had kept her voice for her, and it had just learned a new name to call. The story was not over. It was simply waiting for the next person to come looking for it. The silence, once invoked, had never really ended. It had simply been waiting for a new voice to fill. The case file on the Bell family of Clinch Hollow is now sealed. We are grateful you have borne witness to its conclusion. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to ensure your presence when the next forgotten record is unsealed, and leave your thoughts below on the nature of a silence that learns to speak.